Okay, starting with the end of the war or victory at D-Day, June 6, 1944 was the invasion planned for Normandy, the long-awaited second front of the war. D-Day was pretty much the beginning of the end for Hitler. It was not the end of the war, it was not the surrender of the war, but this is the beginning of the end. The U.S. and England has spent a lot of time building up about 3 million troops, a huge supply of ships, aircraft to carry them across the English Channel, wanting to catch Hitler by surprise. They had been bombing northern France for about 6 weeks before the assault took place. And D-Day had originally been scheduled for June 5th, but was delayed, and 3 divisions were parachuted down behind enemy lines. And British American troops forced their way ashore, taking back control from Germany. By August, Paris was liberated. September, Allied troops were across the German border for the final push towards Berlin. Battle of the Bulge finally weakened the German resistance. It was pretty much known as Hitler's Last Stand, January 1945. By April 1945, U.S. and Russian forces had swept across the river towards Berlin. Allies were coming up with a broad front to meet up with the Russians. And as the Red Army was entering in Berlin, Hitler commits suicide on April 30th, and Germany will surrender May 7th, 11 months and 1 day after Normandy. Since 1942, Allied bombing of Germany had reduced the nation's industry and ability to fight, and after surrender, U.S. troops are going to advance through Germany and come across the concentration camps and witness the genocide that had been going on. People didn't realize the degree of the things that had been going on during the war. Russia is going to claim Eastern Europe as its prize for all the suffering during the war in its war-torn region. U.S. is wanting some sort of collective security arrangement, including the United Nations, believed that the failure of the League of Nations was a huge factor in the coming of World War II. And so Americans are going to vow to put support behind a new collective security attempt. The Big Three Conference, FDR, Churchill, Stalin met at the Yalta Conference. Russia had Manchuria. Stalin had planned for communist domination of Poland. At the Yalta Conference, Stalin negotiated refusing to give the U.S. plans for Eastern Europe. The Potsdam Conference was another one that was all about figuring out the reparations for after the war. And then in between the two conferences, FDR will pass away. When relaxing, he slumped forward and passed away, left no plans for his successor, left it to an inexperienced Harry Truman to manage the rivalry between the Soviet Union and the U.S. that was going to end up developing, and he has quite a difficult time with that. Now that war is done in Europe, we're going to face the Pacific and turn our attention to the Japanese in the Pacific. After Pearl Harbor, Japan had taken over a lot of Eastern Asia and Southeastern Asia. June 21st, 1945, U.S. was going to capture Okinawa, giving them complete control of the Pacific. The Battle of Okinawa left 50,000 U.S. dead, but we did take control of the Pacific with that. Between early May 7th through 8th, the Battle of Coral Sea, we stopped a Japanese invasion of Australia, continued intense air attacks on Japan, began developing the Manhattan Project. This had been news to Truman when he came into office. Spent about $2 billion developing an atomic bomb based on the fission of radioactive uranium and plutonium that had a successful test run. Left a crater in the desert, Los Alamos, New Mexico. Robert Oppenheimer was employed. Einstein had a hand in the development as well. August 6th, the atom bomb destroyed Hiroshima, incinerating 4 square miles and instantly killing 60,000. Eventually led up to 250,000 dying either immediately or after with prolonged suffering. Russia will enter the war against Japan. We drop a second bomb on Nagasaki, and we had no more atom bombs, but none were needed because Japan will surrender unconditionally. And atomic bomb had guaranteed a future arms race with the Soviet Union. All right, at the end of the war, the U.S. ends being the most powerful nation in the world. 11 million men and women in uniform, shipyards, aircraft plants, munition factories. We had the monopoly of the atomic bomb at this point. Unprecedented economic prosperity, and pretty much a permanent fixture of the government in American daily life. Okay, starting in chapter 28, this is looking at the beginning of the Cold War, leading out of the end of World War II that we just covered. All right, so there's three main issues looking at the Cold War beginning, looking at the control of post-war Europe. Stalin seemed to have the advantage at the Potsdam Conference. Truman had become president after FDR passing away. He came to the conference unprepared, idealistic. Stalin was experienced and ruthless and insistent on paying for reparations with German money. The Allied compromise divided Germany into occupation zones that would foreshadow not only the division of Germany, but also the division and tension between the U.S. and Soviet Union that would last for quite a long time after the war. Economic aid was going to be another big issue, and also nuclear disarmament. There's a lot of historian debates over how the Cold War started. Truman's policies, some say the right response would have, was what how he had responded. Others say that he overreacted. Some say he was too soft on communism. But Cold War is going to dominate the international politics from the late 1940s until the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. All right, division of Europe. Like I said, Russians are going to occupy Eastern Europe. They had basically created a European buffer. Churchill feared that the creation of an Iron Curtain, something that he called it in a speech of his, would extend from the Baltic to the Adriatic. It was a name for the European satellite nations, the division between them. Germany's occupation lines became lines of permanent division. The U.S. and England merged their zones and pushed for German unification. The Soviet Union will intensify its grip on the eastern zone. France and the U.S. plan to transfer power to an independent West Germany by 1947. The Soviet Union is going to retain its hold on the eastern half. The Soviet Union was also trying to, like I said before, create this European buffer, laying the basis for their domination. They were intent on imposing communist governments loyal to Moscow. Communists would replace the coalition governments in Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Neither side was willing to withdraw their troops from Europe at this point. The U.S. was demanding that we go for a policy of self-determination where countries get to decide on their own form of government and own leaders through free elections throughout Europe. Each country would freely choose their post-war rulers. Soviets set free elections or see free elections as something they're not willing to give into. And Stalin's going to convert Eastern Europe into a system of his own satellite nations, his Iron Curtain. Germany was the key. Occupation policy of Germany from the Potsdam Conference, the division of Europe, inevitable after World War II, U.S. and England versus the Soviets, completely divided their spheres of influence, and the West views Stalin as the next aggressive dictator, leading a communist drive for world domination, and basically sees him as the new Hitler. For economic aid, Russia was completely devastated by World War II. 15 to 20 million casualties, 30,000 factories destroyed, 40,000 miles of railroad torn up. Agricultural production was cut in half. Industrialization was set back. So they were requesting money from the U.S. for reconstruction and was tabled. Instead of Congress advising using the Lend-Lease Act for reconstruction, America see influence with Russia as something that we needed to take seriously, and the best way was not to give them economic aid. We knew that Russia would have to come to the U.S., and so instead we're going to halt Lend-Lease as leverage, and Stalin sees it as brutal, and we end up losing our leverage instead of it backfires. Our idea backfires on us, and we lose our leverage with the Soviet Union. Soviet Union is going to force to rebuild through reparations, taking it from factories and plants in the areas that they controlled, rather than borrowing from the United States. Russia slowly recovers, but will also develop extreme bitter feelings towards the Americans and their refusal to help. After we'd developed the atomic bomb in secret, Stalin will still learn through the bomb through espionage. His response was to start his own Soviet atomic program, and so we launch ourselves into a nuclear race. We have the Baruch Plan, rapid reduction of U.S. military forces. It was originally a U.S. disarmament plan to take 12 million personnel to less than 2 million, and the plan was to turn nuclear materials to an international agency. Truman, his appointee, Bernard Baruch altered the plan at the insistence of Eisenhower, ignoring scientists who wanted international cooperation and instead wanted to preserve the U.S. monopoly on the atomic bomb. Soviet Union wanted a larger conventional army than the United States. They still have about 3 million, where we have a little less than 2. And we also wanted the immediate abolition of all atomic weapons, or they wanted the immediate destruction of atomic weapons, called for total ban on development and use of nuclear weapons, plus destruction of those that did exist. We don't trust each other, nor have any level of cooperation. So the two superpowers pretty much agreed to disagree. No compromise was reached. Results were international distrust and the Cold War. By distrusting each other, we will go into several decades of tension and Cold War instead. With Truman in office, he has a new Secretary of State, George Marshall, that thought that in broad strategic terms and relies on two men for the development of diplomacy and world affairs and U.S. policy. One was Dean Acheson. He wanted U.S. and England's former role as the mediator of world affairs, Under Secretary of State, and was pretty much given free rein to conduct American diplomacy. He opposed appeasement and advocated negotiating only from peace. George Kennan called for the containment of Russia's expansive tendencies. He heads up the policy planning staff, believed the Kremlin was thought there could be no compromise with a rival power, and wanted to contain or resist the flow of Russian power. So the new course of our diplomacy at this point, and which defines foreign policy for quite a long time, is containment, or consolidating post-war power and establishing a more involved role for America in world affairs. With that containment idea, the first time to implement the containment policy came with Greece and Turkey. The British request they could no longer afford to aid Greece and Turkey in their civil wars against the communist forces. Turkey especially was being pressured by the Soviets for access to the Mediterranean. Greece and Turkey were right on the southern end of that eastern bloc. And so George Marshall, Secretary of State, said that letting something happen to Greece and Turkey would probably lead to problems for the rest of the world. So Truman issues the Truman Doctrine that said support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressure, meaning we need to support those that are being pressured to become communist. U.S. Assumed that Soviet Union influence in Greece would be catastrophic, and so Kennan, Marshall, Acheson advised the Senate to approve giving them money to help prevent such an event from happening. Truman basically scares the public into supporting that money being given and asked the Congress for $400 million to give military and economic aid to the two countries, and it was approved. So the doctrine was basically an informal declaration of Cold War against the Soviet Union. Truman uses the crisis in Greece to secure a national consensus for containment at that point. Many people believed that Western Europe was open to Soviet infiltration because of their economic problems. They were broke, they were hungry, food was scarce, industrial machinery was broke and obsolete, workers demoralized. They had a horrible winter in 1947, which led to a lot of resentment and discontent, and communism began to look more and more appealing to many of those countries that were in poor economic times. George Marshall proposed aid for rebuilding European industries, offered aid to all European countries, an extensive economic plan that would give aid to them, and revival of the working economy to permit emergence of political and social conditions. Russia had refused aid and its eastern satellites, but other Western countries will request a total of $17 billion. Marshall Plan was adopted by Congress, agreed that it would help stimulate European trade and stop Soviet expansion. Not only money, but military was pledged to support. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, known as NATO, was the final phase of containment, developed from the fear of Russian military aggression, and provided for a collective security treaty signed by England, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, the U.S., Canada, many countries, many European countries. It has two main features: U.S. commitment to the defense of Europe and prominent honors commitment with U.S. troops being stationed in Europe. 4 American divisions became the nucleus of NATO to deter any other Russian assaults intensified Russia's fear of the United States, as well as seen as somewhat of an overreaction on our part.